Germany is rearming, and fast, building what could easily become Europe's largest army. Over 200,000 soldiers, tanks, munitions, fighter jets, drones. If they keep their promises, they'll easily spend over $1 trillion by 2030. And the strange part about all this is that no one seems to be alarmed. In fact, the most common response is, "About time, Germany. More of that, please." At any other time in recent memory, learning that Germany was building up a mighty force on the borders with Poland and France, just a stone's throw away from the United Kingdom, well, that would set off a lot of alarm bells. After all, there was a concerted effort among victorious allies in World War II to ensure that Germany was permanently demilitarized, to make sure it could never have powerful armed forces again, could never perpetuate wars of aggression across the continent or across the English Channel. And yet the reaction today to Germany's accelerated rearmament is nothing short of profound relief. Not fear, relief. Now, you probably know the immediate reason Germany is rearming: Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and a new unreliability of the United States. Still, it's hard to overstate how big of a deal remilitarization is to Germans. The changes cut to the very core of Germanness since World War II. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Not just what a remilitarized Germany looks like for Europe, but what it means for Germans themselves. Because, in short, it rips at the fabric of Germany's modern democracy while simultaneously trying to sew it secure. It offers risk and reward not seen in generations. It contains the potential for Germany's democratic middle parties to repel populists, or, in reverse, to be replaced by them. And if far-right populists win, that's ultimately who controls the shiny new military. That's ultimately why the stakes are so high, why I find this so darn interesting, and why I'm eager to share this story with you. And just full disclosure for bias, I did work 5 years at the German embassy here in Washington, D.C. So first things first, we need to understand Germany's rearmament ambitions. In short, the ambitions are big. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Germany has been spending more on NATO, on aid to Ukraine, and on defense at home. The opening scenes of the second Trump administration, including the Oval Office showdown with President Zelensky and Vice President Vance's speech to the Munich Security Conference, were further wake-up calls that Germany needed to do more, and it needed to do more right now. And in the end, the issue of rearmament begins and ends right there with money. Friedrich Merz, in office since May of 2025, promised that his government coalition between his center-right CDU and the center-left SPD would deliver the strongest conventional army in Europe. Well, to build the strongest, you have to spend the mostest. But the starting point for Germany's defense spending was honestly pathetic. Germany's armed forces, the Bundeswehr, were chronically underfunded prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which brought back full-scale war to the European continent. While living in Germany 10 years ago, I remember this news story that became rather infamous. It was soldiers in the German Bundeswehr, the army, training with broomsticks because they were so underfunded they didn't have rifles. And then on top of that, what struck me in speaking with Germans is how okay with it they were, how dismissive they were of their armed forces. I can condense this down to an attitude of, oh, doing drills with broomsticks? Great. We don't need an army. To which I would prod and poke and ask, not even for self-defense? You don't need a military? Which would usually get met with a shrug. Today, with the benefit of hindsight, I can give a couple explanations to this indifference I was experiencing from Germans. First, there is a genuine subculture of pacifism on the left, especially on the hard left. Die Linke, the left party, was born out of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party of East Germany, before reunification. And so for these folks, I think naivete towards Russian imperialism is based on a mistaken nostalgia for the days when the Soviet Union was promoting international socialism through institutions like the Comintern, rather than a realistic appraisal of what Russia is today, what Putin's Russia is. So naive ideological pacifism was one thread. The other thread is, to me, frankly, more understandable. And that is that there seemed a common attitude that after the moral devastation of World War II, Germany just can't trust itself anymore with the military. Never again to those horrors of those years means never again having capable armed forces. So when I was reading, Sönke Neitzel had this quote that I thought was interesting. Defense ministers have in past decades avoided terms like war and battle like the devil avoids holy water. The foreign minister during the time that I was serving at the Foreign Office, I think, put it best. Annalena Baerbock, she said that Germany had, over the years, lost the language of power. In this case, the language of hard power, military force. Germany had basically become the opposite of what everyone feared they might one day become 80 years ago. What David Clay Large called the militarization of the German mind. To someone in 1945, it was obvious that aggression was baked into German psychology. Today, it's the opposite. Today, it's hard to wrest Germans away from their knee-jerk pacifism. I know that the immediate reaction to this is that pacifism through apathy is describing cultural phenomena rather than government policy, but I think you can clearly see how this bled into the public realm. The best example is just the raw defense spending number. 15 years after reunification, so around 2005, Germany was spending roughly 1.4% of GDP on defense. Saw a couple different numbers in my research. For reference, the US has spent well over 3% of GDP on defense for decades. France, around 2%. UK, well over 2%. So fast forward here with me, 16 years later, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, everything kicks off. Where is Germany's defense spending at this moment? It had not altered much at all. Something like 1.5% of GDP, depending on who you ask. That's despite the fact that in 2016, all NATO members, including Germany, agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. That's in spite of the fact that a new American president came around in like 2017, basically openly harassed the Germans to spend more. I was there, I know. By 2022, the Germans just weren't doing it. They felt the pressure, they just weren't going to do it. But fast forward to now, the underspending problem on German defense is gone. Following the start of full-scale war in Ukraine, German defense budgets have gradually appropriated more and more for a revamp of the Bundeswehr. 2024 was the first year Germany finally hit its target of 2% of GDP, 2.1% to be precise, about 90 billion euros. Some figures would give you 88 billion because there were like a few billion just kind of hanging around not being spent that were appropriated, but okay, let's just call it 2%, 2.1% and not quibble too much. They hit their goal 2024. But the Germans are not stopping at 2%, 2.1%. They're going on to 3.5% of GDP for defense spending by 2030. With the current size of the German economy, that would be roughly 150 billion euros per year. Assuming growth, it would be between 150 billion and 200 billion euros. To make that sound a little more concrete, that's more than a doubling of defense spending in less than 10 years, both in GDP percentage terms and in absolute terms. Already in 2024, Germany's defense spending was double that of Poland's, though let's be real, they're unlikely to surpass Poland's spending as a percentage of GDP. What I'm trying to say is, among its peers, Germany is already the biggest defense spender in absolute terms. That spending is going up. And I think that's part of the reason Germany's been so heavily criticized, why it's been so desired that Germany gets in the game. Germany is this massive economy. And if they get in the game, if they spend more, they have a larger impact. And as the biggest spender, Germany may, emphasis on may, field Europe's largest army, barring Ukraine and Russia from the calculation. The government stated target is 203,000 by 2031. That would place it beyond the United Kingdom, 138,000, Italy, 171,000, equal with France, 204,000. It wouldn't put it above Poland, which currently fields an army of about 216,000, and Poland aspires actually to 300,000 active duty soldiers, 250 regular soldiers, 50 so-called regionals, I think, for like local defense. So a couple things would need to happen for Germany to actually field Europe's largest army, one of them being Poland not achieving its 300,000 goal. The most likely path for that to happen would be Poland having to scale back their ambitions because of unsustainable debt. And the second thing that would have to happen is for Germany to up its ambitions from 203,000 to something more like the defense minister is currently advocating, between 250 to 260,000 total soldiers. That's not unthinkable at all because the current goal, 203,000, was set back in 2018. So it hasn't even taken into account the current security situation on the continent. And as Germany grows its ranks, one thing they're going to have to do is to transition away from a exclusively volunteer service to a conscription model. Since 2011, service in the Bundeswehr has been voluntary, not compelled. But volunteerism just isn't working at the moment. The numbers in the armed forces are actually dropping in this moment. It's a surprise given how much money is flowing in. 2020, the Bundeswehr was about 184,000 strong. That number has actually dropped to below 181,000 today. Therefore, conversations about conscription are becoming more mainstream, even if the policy is pretty unpopular with young people. A recent book by a Gen Z author caught some attention. It was titled "Why I Would Never Fight for My Country." And I've got a quote right here from it that's kind of fascinating and argued in part. "I'd rather be occupied than dead." I saw this person on TV the other day being interviewed. He was non-committal. If like Russia bombed his mom to death, like in an air raid, would he join the service? And he was like, nah, I'd probably like run, hide. So obviously this is an extreme example, but the general idea is that there is a sense among young Germans that why would I want to serve when I don't think the country is serving me? It's pretty typical for younger generations right now. Hell, even for millennials like me, there's that attitude out there. Nonetheless, there's a conversation right now about returning to conscription. It's the official policy of the CDU. It's supported by Friedrich Merz, the chancellor. His coalition partners are against it, though. The official policy of the SPD is that conscription cannot come back until all other options have been exhausted. And the first option that's on the table right now is a proposed policy in which all 18-year-old men, not women, all 18-year-old men would need to fill out a survey that says, here I am, here's the state of my health and education. Obviously, just getting an idea of like who exists in the country of fighting age is the first step towards mass conscription. And just as important as the raw number of soldiers is what are these soldiers able to do? And in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been a lot of money spent to equip them. Procurement has been initiated for 35 American F-35s, new tanks, helicopters, other vehicles, Patriot air defenses, ammunition, the list goes on and on. The final bit of ambition for Germany's remilitarization centers around nuclear weapons. Now, it must be made clear that Germany's leaders, from Adenauer in the 50s to Friedrich Merz today, they've all said Germany will never have its own nuclear weapons. Germany is bound by treaty, the 2+4 Vertrag, the 2+4 agreement that basically brought about German reunification in 1990. That treaty said Germany will never pursue chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. Okay then, Mr. Fox, why are we talking about nuclear weapons? Well, because Chancellor Merz has made his explicit goal to achieve independence from the USA in terms of defense, and he said, quote, sharing nuclear weapons is an issue that we need to talk about. We have to become stronger together in nuclear deterrence. So what this means is potentially having France's nuclear umbrella or the United Kingdom's nuclear umbrella covering Germany in addition to the United States' nuclear umbrella. Mutual defense pacts were just signed actually in London between France and the UK, and then Germany and the UK. And French President Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly said he's open to the idea of French nuclear weapons sheltering other European countries. So this isn't that far-fetched at all. So Germany's ambitions are more spending, more soldiers, more equipment, potentially more nukes. German society and polity united to build stronger defense at home and play a greater role in NATO and Europe. It's so simple, right? Hell no. Absolutely not. Making big changes, spending big money, no simple task. And it was complicated because until recently, Germany's own constitution, its basic law, known as the Grundgesetz, was actively working against rearmament. That's what we're going to talk about now. Here's another fun German compound word you need to know. Schuldenbremse, debt brake. It's a mechanism within Germany's constitution that limits federal deficits to 0.35% of GDP. According to Wikipedia, the greatest source of intellectual altruism in human history, the provision can be found in Article 109, Paragraph 3, and Article 115. And lo and behold, I was able to pull it up and confirm. The debt brake is actually a relatively new part of Germany's constitution, introduced by Angela Merkel's CDU party in 2009. They were concerned in the wake of the financial crisis that Germany's debt to GDP ratio would spiral out of control. So they added the Schuldenbremse, the debt brake, to Germany's constitution. It mandated Germany, federally, locally, balanced budgets everywhere. Came to be known famously, infamously, depending on your perspective, as the Schwarze Null, the black zero. So you run a surplus, fine, it can be green, but basically you're not allowed to have any red. So no red numbers on your balance sheet, only nice, simple, crisp, clean black zeros. Why am I talking about the debt brake? Well, it played a huge part in why Germany was unable to achieve 2% of GDP for defense spending throughout the 2010s. Because if you want to spend more on defense, but you're barred from taking on new debt, you really only have a couple options. One of them is to grow the economy, so revenues increase. You can spend more on defense that way. You can raise taxes if you'd like. Or 3, you can take away from other government priorities and then funnel that money into defense spending. So a lot of these are not that palatable. Germany did experience some growth in this period, so they were able to squirrel away a little bit more money for defense spending, but generally speaking, this became a zero-sum game. You want to spend more on defense, you have to take from one pot to fill the other pot. And lo and behold, There wasn't really an appetite for doing that. And this continued after Angela Merkel left office. Olaf Scholz of the SPD succeeded her as chancellor. He led a three-party coalition for a few years. One of his coalition partners was the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, ideologically opposed to higher taxes and new spending, definitely deficit spending. And the coalition included the Greens, who were actually more open to defense spending than you might expect, but in general, more disposed to spend on things like the energy transition rather than revamping the Bundeswehr. What I'm trying to say is that even without the constitutional debt brake there to force balanced budgets, it would have been a Herculean lift to force the German budgets to allocate 2% of GDP to defense. This is why, bottom line, Germany did not spend more on defense, even when their European partners were basically begging them to do so, even when a brand new type of American president was berating them to do so. With the debt brake on one side and unworkable majorities on the other side, Germany was stuck. It would take their old pal, Vladimir Putin, to get them unstuck. In February 2022, Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that changed everything. In Germany, it set up a showdown between the sitting parliament and the constitutional debt brake. 3 days after Russia started its invasion, and I remember this actually really clearly when I was working at the embassy, Chancellor Scholz made this very famous speech before the Bundestag. He went before them and he basically said, we need to spend more right now. We need to spend more on our own defense. We need to spend more on NATO. We need to spend more on Ukraine. We need to go right now, pedal to the metal. Obviously, pedal to the metal is not a German expression. He didn't use that exact phrasing. And I do want to emphasize here for a second, for anyone who is not German watching this, not Polish, not in Eastern Europe, or not close to Russia, it wasn't that long ago that Germany, at least East Germany, was part of the Soviet Empire. And here was Vladimir Putin making speeches about his special military operation, frothing at the mouth with clear nostalgia for the Soviet Empire. And do you know where Vladimir Putin was when the Soviet Union collapsed? He was in Dresden. He was in Germany as a KGB agent. So it was not unreasonable to freak the hell out when Russia invaded Ukraine, because why wouldn't he come for the rest of Europe next? The rest of the former Soviet bloc, at the very least. The Chancellor's speech in February 22 had urgency to it because it was real. We got to spend more right now. We got to bolster our defenses because we might be next. Here comes another German word. I'm so very sorry. Scholz called in his speech for something called the Sondervermögen, the special fund, to revamp the Bundeswehr. That Sondervermögen, that special fund, would be to the tune of 100 billion euros, combined with normal defense budgets that would average Germany out above 2% for the foreseeable future. The Bundeswehr Sondervermögensgesetz, the Army Special Fund Law, received lots of cross-party support. Basically, everyone knew that this was a big moment. 100 billion euros in spending coming right up. But here's a little problem. The constitutional debt brake we just spent time learning about. Everybody wants to vote for new debt, $100 billion in new spending. How are you going to do it without pulling from other government programs? Well, in short, the German Bundestag, the parliament, voted to amend the constitution right then and there. What's kind of funny is they didn't amend the Constitution to remove the debt brake. They amended the Constitution to specifically say, in this decade, we can spend 100 billion euros. They put that number and the time frame into the Constitution of Germany. I don't know. It just makes me laugh because it's if you're from a country with a written constitution, supposedly like a timeless foundation, it's kind of funny to be we can spend this specific amount of money in this specific year. It'd be really funny if the American Constitution said, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, do hereby allocate $130 to decorate George Washington's house in 1793. But that's basically what the Germans did. They took the Sondervermögen, the special fund, they put it right in the Constitution. This is now allowed. And while the actual 2% of GDP didn't really get achieved for a couple of years, money nonetheless started pouring in for procurement of equipment, training of soldiers, bolstering NATO's eastern flank, on and on it goes. All the things we've been talking about. This moment in 2022 came to be known as the Zeitenwende, which means literally turning of the times, but might be better translated as sea change or watershed moment, the Chancellor said in his Zeitenwende speech. We are doing this for us, for our own security. And I know that sounds really basic, but unilateral self-defense. This was the first time really that Germany was taking this seriously since the fall of Berlin in 1945. The eventual defense minister, Boris Pistorius, the current defense minister today, said that Germany needed to become kriegstüchtig, which basically means war ready. And That is some crazy strong language in the body politic of the Federal Republic of Germany. My former boss, which I think I already identified as my boss's boss's boss, the ambassador of Germany to the United States, said that the shifts occurring in Germany were, quote, agonizing, a, quote, profound transformation of national psychology. It was a jettisoning of old orthodoxies that no previous German government had been ready to embark on, more than was even thinkable during reunification, which changed the environment, but didn't change German strategic thinking. I'd liken it to a coming of age for this relatively young democracy. Germany, after World War II, was expected to be passive, reliant, completely demilitarized. But here we are in the current day, and even after, long after its European allies, the United States, had said, hey, it'd be great if you could behave differently and invest in your defense more, they weren't doing it. And to make that shift effectively overnight was a massive upheaval. After federal elections this year pretty decisively rebuked the leadership of Olaf Scholz and his three-party coalition, the CDU's Friedrich Merz became the presumptive chancellor. And almost immediately after the election, Merz came out and said, you know what? We need another constitutional amendment. Why, you might ask? Well, it's because the 100 billion euro fund passed in 2022 was going to run out by 2027. Now, it is not currently 2027, so why would Merz be in such a hurry? Well, that's because the new Bundestag was going to have more from the populist right, the AfD. It was going to have more from the populist left, Die Linke. There was an expectation that if they wanted to take on more debt for defense, they weren't going to be able to get the 2/3 majority necessary in the next Bundestag to amend the Constitution again. Therefore, the clock was ticking. Another crisis. The Constitution needed to be amended, not in 2027. We don't need to wait until the special fund is actually used up. We need to amend the Constitution again right now. The vote was 513 to 207. This is before the newly elected Bundestag even took their seats, before Friedrich Merz was sworn in as chancellor under the auspices of the old Bundestag. They voted in this second constitutional amendment, and this one was far more generous to those who wanted to spend more on defense. Again, they did this thing where they amended the Constitution directly within the language of the debt brake. The new amendment said, any amount over 1% of GDP spent on defense no longer counts towards the debt brake. Let me spell that out a little more explicitly. As of the passage of this amendment, there is basically no limit on the amount of new debt Germany can take on for defense. If the Sondervermögen, the special fund of 2022, was a bucket, this is an ocean. It's a blank check. So if Germany is to truly spend 3.5% of GDP on defense by the end of the decade, this is how it's going to get done, because now the debt brake is done as regards defense. It just takes a simple majority in the Bundestag to spend basically any military budget desired. There's effectively no amount of money that will run afoul of the Constitution. This was an astounding U-turn by Friedrich Merz of the CDU. This was a man who was a debt hawk. He was of the party that created the debt brake back in 2009. He had run a campaign promising, I won't touch the debt brake. I don't want to take on new debt. I want to be conservative in my spending. And then weeks after winning this election, total U-turn. We need to spend this money. We need to amend the Constitution. Let's get it done. You can call it necessary. You can call it practical. You can call it a natural evolution, because as he justifies it, he saw J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Council. He watched this video of Zelensky getting berated in the Oval Office and realized the circumstances had changed. But it also came out that before the election, Merz was already investigating how to amend the Constitution with the old Bundestag. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is, remember this when we talk about the risks to Germany's democracy. That's where we need to go last in our conversation, because we've talked about the amendments to Germany's constitution. We've talked about the ambitions of this new spending, but what we haven't really touched on is the risk involved in all of this change. And let me just kick this off by sharing my personal experience. When I took that job at the German embassy, the reason I felt comfortable taking that job is because I aligned a lot with Germany's modern democracy. I admired it quite a bit. If you come to this political mecca of Washington, D.C., you're immediately hit with lots of opportunities to compromise your values. And of course, you're going to take a job at some point where you're not going to align 100%. It could be a candidate, a sitting office holder, an institution, a think tank, a company, whatever. You're never going to align 100% with your employer, inside or outside of Washington, D.C. But what you hope, at least I think this is something most people hope for, is that they don't have to sell their soul in order to make a paycheck in Washington. I didn't feel I needed to do that to work for the Germans. It struck me while being in Germany, continued to strike me while working for the German Foreign Office at the embassy, how seriously Germany took its remembrance culture. There is a deliberate public effort to not forget the moral devastation of World War II and the Holocaust. This remembrance culture, it's everywhere. Sure, there are critiques of how far this goes. People who resent self-loathing that is baked into the political and educational system, I get it. But at its core, what I see is virtuous. Let me give you an example. I visited the Bundestag around 2016. I went into the basement of the Bundestag on this tour. Before you enter the parliamentary chamber, you will encounter graffiti. The graffiti was left there by the Soviet victors in the Battle of Berlin 1945. And the idea to keep it there is that German lawmakers, anytime they want to go to have their vote, they will be reminded of Germany's lowest moment. And when they're in the chamber, if they look up, there's this glass dome where citizens can basically look down into the chamber. You can kind of see what the representation is there. Lawmakers know they're below the people. There's all this symbolism above to represent modern democracy in Germany, below to represent the moral devastation that Germany unleashed upon the world. From the ashes of World War II and then flowing through German reunification, there was a democratic project that was worthwhile. It was worth preserving. And these choices on defense spending have a major impact on Germany's democratic functioning going forward. There's a distinct tension here. After reunification, Germany's spending on defense gradually decreased. President George H.W. Bush called this the peace dividend. It entered German vernacular as the literally translated Friedensdividende. The idea was that now that the Cold War was over, now that Germany was reunified, it needed to spend more of its money to bring its country back together and to make it prosperous, and less on soldiers on the ground. Instead of money for defense, Germany was able to invest a larger percentage of its gross domestic product into social programs, infrastructure, into what became the grand engine at the center of the European Union by the 2010s. Germany's ability to spend less on defense in order to systemically spend more on other priorities of government allowed it to become a stable, enviable democracy. But now the waters are choppier. The peace dividend is definitely over. Germany is spending more and more on its defense. And there's this fear that it will take away from the other priorities of government that have given Germany political stability, low unemployment rates, innovative export industries. That's why this special fund in 2022 was set up as a special fund, a separate bucket, so it couldn't be put in contention with the other priorities of government. That's why the new amendment says that anything over 1% of GDP doesn't count towards the debt brake. There is an intuition among politicians that they cannot take from the other priorities of government to fund the military, or the people will be extremely angry. Now, it's important to point out that the 2025 amendments to the Constitution also budgeted for $500 billion in new infrastructure spending, 100 of which will be for green infrastructure spending. Nonetheless, those pots will run out just like the 2022 special fund ran out. And unlike defense spending, which is now protected above 1% of GDP, infrastructure and welfare spending don't get those same privileges. This is the material benefits trap. If you put money and attention here on defense spending, people also have to feel attention and spending over here on the other things. While recruiting new soldiers will undoubtedly create jobs, while budgeting more on procurement means more manufacturing at homes, new places that will thrive with this increased spending, this cannot be considered enough by the governing coalition. The German government can rebuild the Bundeswehr. They can succeed. They can pull off this vast and ambitious remilitarization. But if they fail to impress the public in any other arena, they will inevitably cave to the AfD in the next election, who will enter the leadership vacuum and rise to true power. And that's why what feels like a story about self-defense against foreign foes is, at its core, actually a story about fending off the internal foes of Germany's democracy. Unfortunately, this revolution in spending on German defense contains the seeds of its democratic demise. I may one day look back and realize those students I spoke with in my teaching days were correct. Germany really was better off without robust armed forces. The demons of the past weren't as distant as I believed. I just published something totally free on my Substack about Germany's militarization from the end of World War II until reunification. This video got long, so I felt like I had to cut it, but super relevant and interesting. So go check that out. Heads held high. Happy warriors. Later, y'all.